What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading snapshot. We're finishing the book of Ecclesiastes today. We're looking at Ecclesiastes 10, 11, and 12 here. The beginning of this text says that a little folly outweighs a lot of wisdom and honor. And this whole section really is the observations of a man who's wise, a man who has seen a lot of things. He says later on in verse 8, he says, I've seen a person who digs a pit and falls into it. It's interesting. He's like, I've seen somebody who's made something that has actually hurt him. We see that all the time in our life today, that people make things, they make big, impressive things, and they end up hurting them in the end. They don't even realize that their own creation comes back to bite them and comes back to hurt them. It says in verse 12, he says, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. He starts out, the fool, when he talks, he starts out with foolishness, and then he ends with evil, in evil madness. He says, a fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what it will be after him. So basically describing the wise man and the fool man, and he's bringing out a distinction between two types of people here, which is what we see in most of the wisdom literature in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes anyway. It's talking about what does it look like to live wisely, what does it look like to get rid of that wisdom and live in a wicked way. So verse 20 is another interesting one, I think, as you look at this. It says, even in your thoughts, don't curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. Now, that doesn't actually mean that birds will talk, but think about it. There's things that you can say that you think are in secret that end up not being in secret, and especially today, the way technology is, a lot of people have been busted for saying things that they would not have said to people's faces that they would say behind their backs. And what this is saying is, don't even say it behind people's backs. Don't even say it in your own heart, because just so you know, something or someone is going to carry that information to them, and God oftentimes makes sure of it, that people get busted for that. So that's chapter 10. Chapter 11, there's an interesting phrase that's brought up here, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days, which I think what he's talking about here is be wise in the way that you invest, be wise in the way that you give, be wise in spreading out your investment and your time and your effort and your money and a lot of different things so that it won't come back empty. Now, verse 5 says something interesting as well. It says, as you don't know the way that the spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman who's with child. So basically saying you don't know how a soul enters a baby before they're born. You don't even understand how that works. Do you understand how that works? I don't understand how that works. I don't know how it all happens. I don't know what it looks like. We don't all understand all that. How a spirit enters that baby. It says, so you don't know the work of God who makes everything. So when we act like we know everything that God's doing, we just need to be careful. We're like, well, wait a minute, we don't know everything God's doing. Now, obviously, we have a little bit more revelation about that from the New Testament that indicates to us that God is working together all things for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. So there are things like that we can know for sure. We can know, like James 1 says, that even the bad times can be used for our good, but we don't know all that God is doing through things. And it will be foolish for us to act like we did. Now, verse 7 and 8 talk about what it looks like to get old, and he says, as a person lives in many years, just rejoice in them, but let him remember that the days of darkness are many, and also there's vanity in that. Then he says in verse 9, if you're a young person, right, that might have been for the old people, but for the young people it says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know this, for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Just know that God will judge you for everything you do. So enjoy your life. Enjoy the good gifts that God has given you. But just know this, God will bring you before the judgment seat. Specifically, the New Testament says Christians before the judgment seat of Christ. Now, that same theme is picked up at the end of, or at the beginning of chapter 12, where he says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come. And maybe if you're a student watching this, you might say, well, I haven't had those type of evil days that this is talking about. I haven't had prolonged times of bad things. Well, the adults could probably tell you that they have had those long times of bad things. And what this says is, recognize God before you're an old person. Recognize God even in your youth. Even when things are going well for you, look to God and fear Him. He goes on and talks about that. He says at the end of this chapter, it's really the end of the book, and the summary statement that we mentioned a couple days ago, the end of the matter is to fear God and keep His commandments, for that is the whole duty of of man. It says, for God will bring every deed into judgment, whether secret or evil. or every secret thing, whether good or evil. So God's going to bring all these things into judgment. Now, the question for us is, what are we going to do about this? Which is why I think another really important verse to understand this entire book is actually one verse up, actually two verses up. Verse 11. It says, the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the sayings of those given by the one shepherd. Now, I think what he's saying is the words of the wise, they're like goads, which were things that were used to poke animals. It's like when we hear these wise words, what should you do about it? Well, hopefully you feel like you got poked, basically. Hopefully it feels like that you got some sharp object put into you and say, ow, okay, I'm not going to go that way. Imagine taking like these pokey things and just poking the animals and getting them to go in a certain direction. It says that's what it's like when we hear the words of the wise. It pokes us and gets us uncomfortable and makes us want to go in another direction. That's what these wisdom literatures want to do. And as we're kind of wrapping up the main part of our wisdom literature, we've looked at a lot of things that God tells us to do. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to be taking those pokes and saying, no, I'm going to keep going in that direction of evil and sin and selfishness? Or am I going to take those pokes and say, okay, I've been poked. I want to go in the right direction. I want to fear the Lord. That's the mature response to all that. So that's the book of Ecclesiastes. Helpful one for us to study. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, the middle of this section, Paul is telling the false prophets, or actually he's telling the Corinthians about the false prophets. He's saying they boast about their status. They boast that they're really good. Paul says, well, I can play that game too. I'll boast about all the things I do as an apostle. So let me think. As an apostle, I don't have a lot of nice food. I don't have a lot of nice clothing. Instead, I've been shipwrecked. I've been stoned by people. I've been beaten with clubs by people because I'm a Christian. I've been imprisoned. I've been in danger with Jewish people, with Gentile people, with robbers, from hunger, from thirst. I have been left out in the cold with nothing to wear. I've been left out in the cold with no shelter. I've been all those things. And he says, and also on top of that, I have all the daily challenges and anxieties for all the churches that are existing out there that need spiritual leadership. On top of all that, that's what I go through as an apostle. So he says, well, if you want to compare resumes, you false apostles, you've got all these great things you've got, but guess what I have? I have the sufferings of Christ. And when you compare those two, who has more? Who is a genuine apostle? He says, obviously, the world can look at those false apostles and say, well, those look like they're respectable people. But Paul says, no, I'm the one who's suffering for the church, and I do this, and I will boast of my weaknesses. Paul says, I'm fine. You think that it's bad that I've been suffering? Because think about it. From a worldly perspective, how can the leader of this church and this big movement, how can one of the key figures be persecuted and driven around everywhere? Shouldn't he be like exalted and people respecting him? That's what you would expect. But Paul says, I actually boast in the fact that I'm not, because that's showing that I'm serving Christ. Which a helpful thing for us to remember is if we want to live a godly life, we will suffer for Christ. Maybe not this much, maybe not in these ways, but we need to know that one of the marks of genuine Christianity is our willingness to suffer for him. If you're not willing to suffer for Christ, it should bring the genuineness of our testimony and our profession of faith into question. So when you see this, think, wow, I might have to go through this to some extent and say, I'm willing to do it because Jesus has given everything for me. And also, there's other godly people that have gone through worse things before. People like the Apostle Paul. So, thanks for reading with us. We'll see you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.